almost 4 years of Donald Trump have left America's European allies in a state of shock. He's walked out of hugely important treaties.
The fact is, this was a horrible one-sided deal that should have never, ever been made.
He's lashed out at America's friends.
Now, if you look at it, Germany is a captive of Russia.
And he's cozied up to authoritarians.
Okay. Final question.
The idea driving all this, America first, has emanated from Trump's Washington and from embassies all over the world, like here in Berlin. And the effect has been profound, even throwing the basis of the American-led Western alliance into question.
America first, in a way, meant that the US administration would abdicate that role of the leader of the transatlantic and Western alliance.
When you're an alliance that is, founded on deterrence, you want to look like you've got your ducks in a row. It's very hard to have your ducks in a row when one of them is Donald Trump.
In this video, we're going to find out just how much Donald Trump has disrupted transatlantic relations. First, by abandoning the most important international treaties of our time, and then by threatening NATO, the bedrock of America's global power. It adds up to diplomatic disruption on an unprecedented scale. But as we'll find out, even for America's shell-shocked allies, it's not all bad.
It was a rather healthy wake-up call for the Europeans and also for the Germans.
And finally, we're going to ask, what does the future hold for transatlantic relations, no matter who wins the White House? But first, let's go back to the beginning of the story and an almighty break with the past.
Trump's inauguration made it absolutely clear that under him, things were going to be different.
From this day forward, a new vision will govern our land. From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
Peter Wittig was Germany's ambassador to the United States at the time. He'd also served as ambassador to the United Nations, a man who'd seen it all. But even for him, this was new territory.
He knew that Trump was an outsider, and we knew that he would disrupt a lot of the structures in Washington. But we only really got a glimpse of what he really wanted to achieve when we heard his inauguration speech in January 2017. And this was, in a way, quite a shocking experience. And there he laid out a rather somber view, not only of America, but of what we used to call the West. And it spelled out clearly what America first would mean for us. So that was really a rather radical wake-up call for diplomats in Washington and for myself personally.
The omens that followed were not good. On Angela Merkel's first trip to the Trump White House 2 months later, the new president appeared reluctant even to shake her hand.
Things quickly got serious with Trump's first major move against the diplomatic order.
In order to fulfill my solemn duty to protect America and its citizens, the United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord Thank you.
The Paris Accord is the global pact to cut greenhouse gas emissions in the hope of preventing catastrophic climate change. It was the culmination of decades of international negotiations. 195 nations signed it. France's president even called it a beautiful revolution.
Trump's decision was a massive blow. His predecessor had been central to hammering out the deal in the first place. As an expert who was closely involved in the whole process explains.
It was absolutely crucial that the Obama administration supported the Paris Agreement. The Obama administration played an instrumental role to get China on board and to support a meaningful contribution from China to the Paris Agreement. And without the US, we wouldn't have got the Paris Agreement.
But Trump insisted that the agreement was unfair to the US. He said he would try to negotiate a new deal.
Nothing became of that. But despite the setback, the Paris Agreement did remain intact.
With the real effects of climate change being felt around the globe, the rest of the world stuck by the deal. Still, Trump's decision left allies in Europe appalled.
I think one can say this is one of the topics that alienated the most in terms of losing sympathy in Europe for the Trump administration. It really pointed to a fundamental difference in the approach to environmental protection, and I think that really created a big rift also in the mindset of the people.
The next big rift came just a year later, when Trump announced he was pulling out of another landmark treaty, the Iran nuclear deal.
The fact is, this was a horrible, one-sided deal that should have never, ever been made.
The Iran deal of 2015 was designed to prevent the Islamic Republic from developing a nuclear weapon, with Tehran scaling back its nuclear program in return for relief from sanctions. Trump said that the deal failed to keep Iran in check. But for European leaders, his decision squandered a hard-won diplomatic victory.
It wasn't just a deal involving the US and the Europeans, but most importantly also, of course, Russia and China, and of course, Iran. And the fact that all those nations could have agreed in such a delicate issue on a deal that we considered a major achievement.
Trump's disregard for these landmark treaties was particularly galling here in Germany, where there's a profound belief in multilateralism as the right approach to global problems.
In Germany, with 2 world wars and the Nazi rule, they find themselves in a situation where any national approach to foreign policy, to international relations, is totally discredited, from a German point of view. So for us, this downgrading of multilateral cooperation that the Trump administration pursued is particularly hard to take.
On top of that, there was another Trump threat to something even more profound to America's European allies, the alliance that underpinned their relationship, NATO.
Trump swept into NATO with the same abandon he'd shown over Paris and Iran. At his first summit in 2017, he even appeared to push the Montenegrin prime minister out of the way. But it was the following year that the fireworks really began, when Trump took part in a breakfast that has become NATO folklore. Sitting across the table from NATO's Secretary General, Trump launched into a tirade against Germany's heavy use of Russian natural gas.
Now, if you look at it, Germany is a captive of Russia because they got rid of their coal plants, they got rid of their nuclear. They're getting so much of the oil and gas from Russia. I think it's something that NATO has to look at. I think it's very inappropriate. You and I agree that it's inappropriate. I don't know what you can do about it now, but it certainly doesn't seem to make sense that they pay billions of dollars to Russia, and now we have to defend them against Russia.
DW NATO correspondent Teri Schultz was there.
The breakfast was quite a shocking way to start the day. This was due to be just a simple photo op.
He's screaming at Secretary General Stoltenberg across the table about Germany being a captive of Russia. And you just remember looking at these pictures of President Trump and all his aides on the side of the table, and the rest of them, including Secretary Pompeo at the time, sort of looked at their plate.
It didn't make for a happy atmosphere, and Angela Merkel fired back with what was by her low-key standards a stinging rebuke.
Ich möchte aus gegebenem Anlass hinzufügen, dass ich erlebt habe auch selber, dass ein Teil Deutschlands von der Sowjetunion kontrolliert wurde. Und ich bin sehr froh, dass wir heute in Freiheit vereint sind als die Bundesrepublik Deutschland und dass wir deshalb auch sagen können, dass wir unsere eigenständige Politik machen können und eigenständige Entscheidungen fällen können, und das ist sehr gut.
The whole episode caused such a stir that NATO started making arrangements to try to make sure it couldn't happen again.
And since then, all meetings at NATO that were going to involve President Trump have been scaled back to minimize the amount of time he's going to be on the ground. I mean, the average person watching may not notice, but you don't call meetings of NATO leaders summits anymore because they fear that would give too much of a spotlight to the event. And so it might be used by the Trump administration, as a platform for either attacking the alliance itself or being used as a podium for some other issue.
But there is substance to Trump's problem with NATO. That Germany and many other European member states don't spend nearly as much on defense as they've promised to.
Many presidents have complained about this over the years, just none as aggressively as Trump. And it seems that his approach has had some effect.
I don't think that the Europeans did take it seriously until President Trump scared the, living daylights out of them, that he would pull the troops home in retaliation if they didn't. So that's not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing for NATO. It's not a bad thing for the countries themselves. Remember, we're talking about investment in their own defense budgets that then benefits NATO.
It was a rather healthy wake-up call for the Europeans and also for the Germans to not free ride in terms of, let's say, defense spending and not rely always on the US to provide protection, but to be on their own in terms of the European Union, for instance, get our act together. Spend more on defense, develop a defense union that deserves its name.
And yet Trump's approach has sometimes appeared to border on the vindictive. Earlier this year, he announced that he would pull thousands of troops out of Germany. Berlin was not even notified in advance.
This was a clear slap at the German government. And what that does is it just adds a feeling of unease through the alliance about what might happen next.
So what is the outlook for the Western alliance?
Let's revisit Inauguration Day for a moment, and that rallying cry that's defined Trump's foreign policy.
A new vision will govern our land. From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
That slogan, America First, calls to mind a famous saying in international affairs.
It comes from this man, Lord Palmerston, Prime Minister in 19th century Britain. He said, "We have no eternal allies. Our interests are eternal, and those interests it is our duty to follow."
That idea that interests are more important than allies really sums up America First. Germany's former ambassador to the US, Peter Wittig, says that Europeans will have to adapt to that if Trump gets re-elected.
We would have to realize that in core spheres of our values, we would not be seeing eye to eye, but that would not or should not prevent us from pursuing common interests. For instance, when it comes to Russian hybrid warfare, or when it comes to Chinese practices in its new assertiveness.
But it's those shared values that underpin the trust at the heart of the Western alliance. Without them, can it survive? That's the nagging question here in Europe. And little wonder that most European governments are quietly hoping that Biden will win.
We want to see a restoration of American moral and political leadership of our alliance of what used to be called the West. And secondly, we want to have a friendly and well-meaning conversation about the issues that we want to tackle.
Those issues include climate change and the situation with Iran. And Biden has promised to re-enter the Paris Agreement and said he's open to rejoining the Iran deal too. That's music to the ears of European diplomats. But for Peter Wittig, most important of all, would be a return to that sense of shared values.
Just the simple fact of respect and decency, returning to the behavior between allies, that would be a big step forward to restore trust and to restore a common sense of purpose of what we are as like-minded partners that uphold values of democracy and pluralism and human rights and rule of law and environmental protection. And this is, I think, what many people in Europe are craving for.
Over at NATO, DW's longtime correspondent Teri Schultz says people there are hoping for something more mundane. They just want the surprises to stop.
This is not only because of what policies Biden may or may not have, it's simply because he is seen as a more predictable partner. I just can't emphasize enough how much of this angst in Europe is not even about the policies that President Trump announces, but simply about the fact that you never know where they're coming from. You don't know what they're fueled by.
This is the swirl of disorientation, of disappointment and sheer exhaustion that America's European allies are caught up in after 4 years of Donald Trump. So it hardly seems surprising that they're hoping to see him leave the White House. If he doesn't, well, buckle up. Another 4 years of this, and the transatlantic relationship could look very different.